Hello everyone, Professor Quizlook here. So I wanted to make a follow-up video just digging a little bit deeper into what we mean by authoritarian regimes. So when we talked in class, we talked about and we discussed and we tried to start to unpack that not all authoritarian regimes are the same. We talked about this idea of a spectrum, that some autocracies have what we would consider the hallmarks of democracies, like elections, some civil society, while other authoritarian regimes are more extreme. They don't hold regular elections, or their elections are certainly predetermined, and civil society is oftentimes crushed. So when we hear the words dictatorship, like in our reading, or even authoritarian regime, we may automatically imagine an extremely closed system, like we used North Korea in class, where there are no meaningful elections or no opposition, no meaningful oppositions, intense censorship of the media, and of course a hallmark of a totalitarian regime is extensive repression. Those regimes, like North Korea, absolutely do exist. The most extreme, remember, on a spectrum, the most extreme regimes, those do actually exist. But as we saw from our reading in chapter 1, one idea in what we tried to work through in class, but once we start to really dig into some examples, we'll see more of this, that dictatorships do differ from one another almost as much as they differ from democracies. Remember what we talked about. No authoritarian regime, even though democracy, is all the same. So some authoritarian regimes, North Korea, very closed systems. Others, authoritarian states, still have elections. They have multiple political parties. They might have legislatures. They might have courts. They might have constitutions. Most states, even if they're autocracies, have these things: constitutions, courts, a legislature, and surprisingly, some even have independent media or some version of independent media. So rather than imagining only two boxes, democracy versus an authoritarian state, it can be useful again to imagine this as a spectrum, that states fall somewhere along the line. So even when we think about what it means to be a democracy, that's why we started out with our discussion. What is a democracy? To be a democracy, to have a democracy, it is more than simply having in elections. As we saw from chapter 1 of Israel in France, they use a pretty basic starting point. Rollers in democracies are selected through contested elections. So that's important to think about. Not just an election, but a contested election. One source that I oftentimes use in class is Freedom House. Freedom House uses a broader conception of democracy, that it's government based on the consent of the governed, that there are accountable institutions, that there is a rule of law, that there is a protection of human rights, independent courts, independent media, and of course, we talked about in class several times, an independent civil society that is allowed to function and grow. And Freedom House talks about how there is a genuine opportunity for political power to change hands. So these are much more of what students talked about in class today. When we tried to figure out what is a democracy, these are the hallmarks of a democracy. Because we can see, even in an authoritarian state, they hold elections, but are they contested? Are people allowed to run? So a key point here is that elections are important, but elections by themselves, elections solo, do not necessarily create a democracy. So our reading calls attention to what scholars sometimes call the gray zone between dictatorship and democracy. Democracy on one side of the spectrum, dictatorship on another. So we can imagine a country where elections occur regularly, opposition parties are technically legal, citizens may vote, we can see that there's a building that houses a legislature, courts even exist, newspapers or websites criticize the government. So at first glance, this seems like it has all of the hallmarks of a democracy. But now, if we look a little deeper, and we see that the incumbent dominates television coverage. Opposition candidates are maybe harassed by the state apparatus. Government resources are exclusively used to help the ruling party. Courts favor the government. Journalists face maybe not repression, but pressure from the state, and electoral rolls are manipulated. So we can suddenly ask, yes, this country does have elections, but that doesn't tell us very much. Instead, we need to ask how meaningful competition actually is. It's one of the first things that when we were talking in class, a student brought up this idea of, okay, how competitive are those elections? And so we listed, and the reading listed some, and we brought in some others, these different ways to characterize authoritarian states. And so this is where there's the emergence of competitive authoritarianism. And this becomes useful for us to incorporate. So competitive authoritarian states contain democratic institutions, but incumbents violate democratic roles enough that the playing field becomes heavily tilted in their favor. So again, remember, elections matter, but are those competitive elections? Can alternative parties and candidates actually win? So importantly, they are not necessarily completely closed dictatorships. We know they're not fully democracies, but they still have some of these pieces, but we know they're not completely closed off, like the most extreme cases, like North Korea. Again, there may be opposition parties, opposition candidates, courts, legislatures, but there are still, the state apparatus still is in favor of the incumbent. So again, I use Freedom House in class a lot. We'll probably read some from it. I oftentimes reference it when I'm teaching. And I like how they represent, they use free, partly free, and not free. You can just search for Freedom House and you can see how they rank countries and on their media, on their civil society overall. So this isn't exactly the same typology that Ezra and France use, but it illustrates the same general point, that political systems vary substantially in political rights, civil liberties, media openness. So when we look at Freedom House, their reports oftentimes argue that countries occupying the space between democracies and authoritarian states have been moving towards authoritarian, but not all the way to North Korea, which is oftentimes an example that we use. So we know that the big takeaway is that states are on a spectrum. We can look at the most closed, the most authoritarian, like a closed authoritarian system, where it's a very closed regime, meaning electoral competition might disappear, but that looks very different than a country kind of in the middle of the spectrum where there are elections, but maybe there's some state pressure to keep the incumbents in. And then on the democratic side, the democracy side, where elections are free and fair and competitive. So the big takeaway from our reading that we want to think about is that countries, their political systems, are on a spectrum. And it doesn't mean that by looking at an authoritarian state that we are excusing any shortcomings of any other state. We're just trying as academics, as political scientists, as students to understand, okay, this is how this system works, this is how this system works. And we know it is on a spectrum from the most democratic to the most authoritarian. Thank you.